Backrooms felt like going to a really nice restaurant that is serving you this amazing looking meal with the best ingredients in the world, but without any spice. Now, we cannot talk about the movie without first mentioning the director, or rather his age, because at just 20 years old, he became one of the youngest directors in history to get a major deal with a studio. And not just any studio, but A24, which in itself is a huge stamp of approval. But while this is undeniably impressive, especially at such a young age, it is not quite the full picture. The film had a budget of up to $10 million and, more importantly, a long list of very experienced producers. Which is completely okay, but the reason I bring that up is because if we were to compare it to other debut movies from YouTubers turned filmmakers like Talk to Me with a budget of $4.5 million, Iron Lung with $3 million, and more recently Obsession with less than $1 million, all of which have punched far above their weight and massively over-delivered, suddenly Backrooms feels less like an underdog put together by a kid in his bedroom and more like a big production with some serious resources behind it. So while I'm really excited for the director, and believe me, I am rooting for him, I was mindful not to let me being supportive of a young filmmaker get in the way of me being honest about the movie. And my honest opinion is that while it looks impressive, polished, and quite competently made, it is ultimately soulless. And I simply could not connect with it. Which is interesting because, in theory, all the stars were aligned for me to really like it. It is exactly in my wheelhouse. So the most important question was to ask myself, why did it not click? And the more I looked into the backstory of how this whole thing came together, the more it started making sense. Kane Parsons has been uploading all kinds of short films on YouTube ever since he was about 14 years old, combining the classic old-school found footage elements with this modern-day eerie, haunting, almost dreamlike vibe. He clearly had a talent and a vision, and he would continue to develop his style by adapting existing stories into it, like making a popular anime look like real historical footage. So in 2022, after a creepy anonymous post about a never-ending maze of rooms went viral, he released a short film directly inspired by it. At this point, the Backrooms, as they were called, already had a dedicated fanbase, so he did not invent the concept, but his interpretation of it, with the grainy found footage and grounded realism, was the one that really caught on, generating tens of millions of views basically overnight. People wanted more, and he kept making more, with each new episode adding more to the lore, and by the end of it he had a massive following and hundreds of millions of views. To his credit, he did a lot, if not everything himself, from composing the music to teaching himself visual effects. So when you combine the great reception with clear audience interest and a young talent that has consistently delivered and shown potential, you can see why A24 would be comfortable with giving him a relatively big budget despite having no real industry experience. Plus, taking creative risks is kind of their thing anyway, so it makes perfect sense. The idea was to take what worked from the series and adapt it into a feature-length film, with the basic premise being that a furniture store owner discovers a strange door to another dimension with seemingly never-ending hallways and rooms that defy the laws of physics. It's a high-concept film, and the concept itself is the real star of it. It's all about the backrooms. Even the posters barely have the characters in it, which ironically is a great visual metaphor for one of the main issues I had with the movie. It's clear that Kane Parsons is a very strong visual storyteller. Looking back at his original series, they absolutely nailed the atmosphere and the tone, but very little of it was actual dialogue and even less characters. And while that is perfectly fine for a few-minute short film, it is not nearly enough to carry a 2-hour feature-length film. So his biggest strength is also his biggest weakness. We spent a lot of time in his comfort zone, exploring the backrooms, hanging out, looking around, and for the most part, those moments work. But as soon as the characters had to actually communicate and be real people, the cracks begin to show. The film is trying really hard to give them some depth and to explore some deeper themes, but it doesn't want to commit. We have some hints of dealing with emotional trauma, forgiveness, and being complacent with your life, but all of those are so surface level that it feels like a forced afterthought, like it was added a week before they started filming. And you can argue that it's a horror film, it's all about the cool concept, not about deep character exploration, but those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. If we were to compare it to Weapons, for example, which is also a high-concept film, there were multiple layers that actually made me care about the characters, from the school teacher dealing with shame, guilt, and collective hostility towards her, to the father struggling with the immense self-imposed pressure of being this hyper-masculine protector. Even the junkie had plenty of depth to his character, and the high concept was only enhanced by experiencing it through people we can actually relate to. Backrooms felt like it was trying to say something without really having anything to say. So this desperate attempt to make the characters deeper than they actually are is also being manifested in the acting, which unfortunately sometimes took me out of it. Now, I really want to stress that I don't think any of the actors are bad. They're not. The two leads alone are both Oscar nominees, but I don't think they were given enough to work with. And in the few moments they actually had something, the direction they were given was the most on-the-nose, obvious one, which is directly related to the other big issue of the film. Every single choice was the most obvious one. There will be absolutely nothing that will surprise you, which in my opinion is all coming from the script. The thing is that when you're always making the obvious choice, you'll inevitably stumble into a lot of cliches, and there are plenty of those in here, to the point of it being distracting. Like, hey, we have a character tied to a rope that went down through a narrow corridor into a creepy room, and now we're pulling him back up. What is going to happen next? If you guessed that just as he's about to safely make it back up, he suddenly gets pulled back, you're absolutely right. Countless examples like that. One of the biggest offenders for me was when the therapist hurt her leg as she was trying to run away from a scary creature, which, as if it didn't feel forced and lazy enough already, was only made worse by the fact that she hurt her leg in a room literally filled with couches and pillows. Seriously. Now, to be fair, I don't think much of that was up to Kane Parsons himself. I don't know how much creative freedom he had, certainly to an extent, but considering he has no experience, he's very young, and A24 is investing a considerable amount into the project, I don't imagine he had a lot of say when it came to the actual script. To me, it seems like he was focused primarily on the visuals and the tone, while the rest of the film, judging by the long list of producers, feels like it was almost engineered in a boardroom. Kind of like Marvel, you know, how no matter who the director is, they all follow strict guidelines and end up having the same consistent tone. This feels like the A24 version of it, like they have it down to a science what makes a perfect modern day elevated horror, and just added a bunch of items from a checklist. Wide lenses, low angles, negative space, slow zoom-ins, and plenty of audio jump scares. But anyway, I probably made it sound like I think it's bad. I don't. I just felt deeply unsatisfied, because it could have been really good. It was always teasing you, but never giving you enough. The backrooms were never scary enough, the government conspiracy was never enticing enough, the creatures were never compelling enough, the characters were never relatable enough. You only got a taste, but never a full bite. I don't know if that's a thing people say, but you get the idea. And still, I have to give it some credit. First of all, I will always respect anyone who prioritizes practical filmmaking. Apparently, they built close to 30,000 square feet of backrooms for the movie, and that was easily the best and most important directorial choice. Not only does it look gorgeous, but you really feel like you're there, and you can almost reach and touch the walls yourself. I think that Kane Parsons is showing a lot of potential. There was this one particular moment, for example, when the character first discovers the door to the backrooms and it's just a tiny little crack in the wall, and when the camera slightly moves, it disappears and then slightly appears again, and that alone shows that he knows what he's doing. There were also a few surprisingly good comedic beats actually. He seems to understand the fundamental principles of comedy, like something happening in a close-up and then cutting to a wide shot to reveal the punchline. At the end of the day, I'm pretty sure that the general audience will like it. And as a 20-year-old director, to pull off a production like that with all the pressure that comes with it is a major accomplishment no matter what. When I was 20, I was still trying to figure out how to talk to a human woman and get a high score in Yu-Gi-Oh! So Kane Parsons should be proud of himself, as opposed to perhaps the director of Batman and Robin, who ended up having to publicly apologize for the film he made. It's a crazy story, and you can check out my video about it right now.